In this video, we'll add some more programming constructs that'll make our code a lot more interesting. First of all, we're going to talk about selection statements, and these will allow us to change or branch the code's execution based on the evaluation of an expression. There are two C# selection statements that we'll look at today, the if statement and the switch statement. And then next we're going to look at arrays that allow us to collect and manage groups of data. And we'll use that as a springboard to look at iteration statements. Now, iteration statements allow us to loop through each item in a group of data, and we can change each item in the array, or we can just evaluate it, or a number of different things depending on what we're trying to do within our application. And there are three iteration statements that we're going to look at today, and those would be the for each statement, the for statement, and the while statement. And then finally, we're going to tie all three of these concepts together, iteration statements, selection statements, and arrays, with a real-life scenario that'll give you some context for why this stuff is so important. Now, as I said in the introduction, selection statements allow you to decide whether or not to execute a block of code based on the evaluation of an expression. So let's dive right into the code to see what I mean by that statement. Let's go ahead and create a new project. We'll call this Lesson 5. And let's just get rid of that. We don't need that. And to set up this example, I'm going to place a button and a combo box on our Forms Designer surface. There we go. I'm going to add some items to the combo box. Some names here. And then I'm going to double-click button 1, and we'll write the majority of our code demonstrations right inside this button 1 click event. And from this point out, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. I'm going to work under the assumption that watching somebody code is about as exciting as watching paint dry. So what I'm going to do is just paste in some examples that I created earlier. And so the first example here is an if statement. Now, notice the syntax. First of all, we start with the keyword if, and next we have a set of parentheses. And between the parentheses, we are evaluating an expression. We talked about evaluating expressions in the previous video. In this case, we're going to test to see what the combo box selection was. Was it Bob or Beth, Conrad or Grant? And if it's Bob, then you can see underneath of our if statement, the next lines of code is a code block defined by curly braces. If combo box 1.text does in fact equal Bob, as we use the equal evaluator, two equal signs put together, then it will execute these lines of code that are contained within the code block directly underneath the if statement. So let's run this application and see that in fact this does work. I'm going to select, first of all, a different name, and you notice when I click the button, nothing occurs. Let's now select Bob and then click the button, and we get our message box, you picked Bob. Cool. Okay, so let's move on. Let's comment out this first example, and let's make room for another example. Now, in the second example, it's very similar to the first one. Notice that I'm still testing the condition combo box 1.text. This time I'm going to check to see if it's equal to Beth. Now, the difference between the first example and the second example is that I've omitted the curly braces. And the reason is because in C#, you don't need curly braces to define a code block if you're only going to execute one line of code after the if statement. In this particular example, I only have one line of code after the if statement, and this line of code, message.box.show you pick Beth, will only execute if the condition is true in the if statement, combo box 1.text equals Beth. So let's go ahead and run this example just to verify this works. And I'm going to select something different, and notice that even though the messagebox.show statement is not enclosed in a curly brace, and I've selected a different name than Beth, it still does not execute. But when I select Beth and select the button, notice that I indeed get the message box as I planned. Excellent. Let's comment out this line of code and move on to a third example. Okay, in this case, we're going to make it a little bit more complicated and introduce two new thoughts. So what I've done here, first of all, is embed an if statement within another if statement. So you can see here in the first couple lines of code, I check if combobox1.text is not equal, notice the exclamation mark equal sign to test the condition of not equal to Conrad. If that's not true, then we're going to test some other things inside the context of our first if statement. So if it's not true, then let's continue on and do some more testing. If combobox1.text equals Grant, then the message box is you pick Grant. But if it's not Grant, then I show another message box which says, I'm not sure who you picked. Notice that I've introduced a new element called else. If the first condition is not true, then the second one will be executed. So for example, let's look at this statement, if combobox1.text equal Grant. If that's not true, then the code block underneath the else statement will be executed. Now notice that I also have an else statement that corresponds with the original if statement at the very top. Not the one that's embedded, but the one that encloses the second if statement. If combobox1.text not equal to Conrad. Well, if it is equal to Conrad, which would be the opposite, then the second else statement will be executed. Messagebox.show you picked Conrad. So again, this is a little bit more complicated example. Let's run it to see how it works. And I got an idea. Actually, let's stop this and let's put a breakpoint here, so that we can watch the execution of our code and monitor how it works, like we introduced in the first video in this lesson series. So in this case, I'm going to pick Beth, and I'm going to click the button. Now, notice that I get my little yellow line of execution. I'm going to hover my mouse cursor over the word text, and notice that combobox1.text equals Beth. Great. So what we'll do next now is step into the next line of code, and notice that I click it a couple times and I get to the next if statement. It's not equal to Conrad, it's equal to Beth. So now we're going to try the second if statement. If combobox1.text equals Grant, well, we know that it's Beth, so this would not be true either. Let's go ahead and step further and notice that we're now into the else statement. We skipped over the if statement because it was not true. So it's going to display the message box, I'm not sure who you picked. Okay. And then let's just continue on here, and we'll exit out of that gracefully. Now let's pick Grant. Again, let's go back to our code view and step into our example. It's going to see if combobox1.text equals a Grant, and it does. So let's step into that, and it's going to now display the message box, you picked Grant. Excellent. So let's continue to execute these lines of code until we get out of the handler, and now let's pick Conrad. Go back to our code example and start stepping through. And if combobox1.text is not equal to Conrad, well, that's a false statement. Combobox1.text is equal to Conrad, so we would expect the else statement to be executed, in which case you pick Conrad. So I hope that's clear by stepping through these lines of code and we get a better idea of how this example works. So let's go ahead and stop the execution of this. Let's get back to our code, and let's go ahead and get rid of our breakpoint, comment out this example so we can move on from here. Great. There's actually a few more variations on the if statement, but I'm not going to go into those right now. This should be enough to get you far enough into learning about selection statements that you can learn more about the if statement on your own. Let's move on now to a different selection statement called the switch statement. For this next example, I want to add a list box to our Forms Designer surface. And under Tasks, I'm going to select Edit Items, and here I'm going to type in foobar BASQuark, widgets, and gadgets. All right, and we're going to close that up. And now we're going to get back to our code view and scroll down to the bottom of our existing examples. I'm going to paste in some code. All right, that looks right. Let's go ahead and save this. Okay, we're going to talk about the switch statement. First of all, notice the first line of code, switch, and then we're going to evaluate listbox1.selectedItem. Which item was selected by the end user? We're going to perform a toString on that because the selected item will not bring it back in the format that we need. So that's the reason for the use of the toString. Now, the way that I discovered this was that I just put selected item, and I noticed whenever I was first working on these examples that I got an exception. I read the exception, and it said that it wasn't in the correct format, so I tried the toString, and that seemed to work. So that's how kind of the trial and error that sometimes you need to go through if you're not familiar with a particular property or method on a given object. So don't be afraid to experiment and just try some things out, and eventually you'll figure it out. But anyway, that's the thought process behind that. So we're going to now evaluate the selected item for listbox1. And notice that within the block of code underneath the switch statement, I have a couple of case statements. If the case is foobar, so if listbox1.selectedItem evaluates to the word foobar, then we're going to show a message box that says you picked foobar. And notice the next case statement, if we have something called BASQuark selected, then we're going to show a different message box. Finally, we have a statement called default. This is the default case. So if foobar or BASQuark don't apply, if the user selected something other than foobar or BASQuark, then we're going to run the lines of code underneath the default case, in which case you pick something else. Okay. Notice also underneath each of the case statements we have a break statement. And what a break statement will do is that it will stop the execution of code so that no other cases are considered. So if after we run this line of code, we hit the break statement, and what that'll do is exit out of our code block defined by our open and close curly braces so that none of the additional cases are evaluated. Let's go ahead and run this application just to see how it works, and let's go ahead and put a break statement here and then run it. So let's select BASQuark, for example. Now let's go to our code view and start stepping through it. I can hover over and notice that the selected item equals BASQuark. Notice that it immediately jumped to case BASQuark, and if we execute this line of code, we'll get a message box that says you picked BASQuark. Okay. Now, once we hit our break statement, notice that it'll jump out over the default statement, and the next line of code that it'll go to is the end of our method. So it just completely ignores all the rest of the code within our switch statement. Okay, so a switch statement is helpful when you have a lot of different options. The if statement was great if we had 2 or 3 options that we could go through, but we would have to use either some complex if statements to get this type of functionality where we had maybe 10 or 15 different cases, whereas we can just put them in a simple switch statement, and it's a little more elegant in that regard. So let's stop the execution of this application. Let's comment out this example, and let's move on. So that pretty much ends our discussion of selection statements. You can see that we've demonstrated a couple of different selection statements, and the difference between the if statement and the switch statement is that each one has its strengths. There's 2 different tools that essentially do the same thing, but are used in different scenarios, as I just explained a moment ago. Now, in software development, you're often going to find that there's more than one way to do something, and it's not a matter of the right way versus the wrong way in many cases, but maybe rather which method is more expedient given the current circumstance. So in some cases, the if statement is more elegant, and in other cases, the switch statement is a more elegant way of solving the particular programming problem that you're currently facing right now. Okay, so let's move on and talk about arrays. So I wanted to introduce the concept of an array right now in between our discussion of selection statements and iteration statements, because it's going to help us understand iteration statements a little bit better. An array is basically a type of collection that allows you to group together a bunch of values that are somehow related. Now, for example, you could have a group of values that represent a price schedule for a given product. You can have a group of values that represent the times that a bus is going to arrive at a given stop on its route. You can have an array that includes the test results for all the students in a class. You can have a collection of values that are stored in a list box, for example, and we can loop through each item in the list box. Any grouping of values together can be treated like an array. Now, the most important thing you can remember about arrays is that all the items in the array must be the same data type. So when you define an array, you're defining a single variable of a single type. But that variable can hold more than one value. And the way that you put values in that variable and grab values out of that variable is different than just your normal run-of-the-mill variable. So let's talk about how to define arrays. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that, and we're going to scroll down here and paste in some code. Okay, so what I have created here, an example of a sized array. Notice first of all, in this first line of code, that I have string my array. Now I've added a few things to it. After the keyword string for our data type, I've included an open and closed square bracket. This tells C# that I want to create an array of type string. Now on the right hand side of the equal sign, there's a keyword called new. We're going to talk about the new keyword in the next video on object-oriented programming. So let's just table that discussion for a few moments and just accept the fact that in order to create an array of strings, we're going to need to use the keyword new. Next thing I've done is define the number of elements that will be in my array. So in this case, my array will hold two values. There will be two elements, both of type string, that will be handled by my array. Now the next two lines of code demonstrate how to set those values. So for example, my array with an index of 0 equals Bob, and my array of an index of 1 equals Beth. Those are the two items that will fit inside of the variable my array. Okay, so first of all, notice that the indexes that I use to access elements of an array are 0-based. You can't start with the number 1 and go to number 2. If, for example, I try this and try to run the application and click my button, I'm going to get an exception. It says the index was outside the bounds of the array. The word bounds is used a couple of times in various contexts in regards to arrays, and a bounds is just like a boundary for football or basketball or any sport, and you can't go outside those boundaries. The boundary for this array is the fact that it can only accept two items. Anything more than that is out of bounds. So let's go ahead and just get rid of our little box here and comment this out one more time. Okay, stop the application. Now let's go ahead and run the application now that we've commented this out. And when I click the button, we notice we get the value Beth because, as you can see, we are showing in a message box the second element of the array using the index of 1 to access that second element, which indeed is Beth. Okay, so hopefully that at least shows you how to define a sized array. Now let's talk about another type of array that you can define, or another way to define an array. In this next example, let's paste in some code here, I have an initialized array. Now notice the syntax is different between example 5 and example 6. The first part on the left-hand side of the equal sign is basically the same. I'm defining a string array called my array, but on the right-hand side of the equal sign, I don't use new string and then pass in the number of elements that I want to define the size of the array as. I'm initializing the values of the array, which by default will set the size to basically 4 items. So I initialize it by passing in the strings Bob, Beth, Conrad, and Grant. Now when I, on the next line of code, whenever I go to show a message box with my array element 1, what am I actually doing? Let's go ahead and run the application and see it in action. And we're displaying Beth. Again, the same rules apply. The first, or index of 1, is actually the second element in the array. So in this case, this is the second element, and that was what was displayed in our message box. So the difference between the sized array and the initialized array is how we define the size and where we initialize the values or set the values that will be contained within the variable myArray. Okay, let's comment this out. And hopefully that's enough information about arrays for the moment. Now please understand that I've really simplified the concept of an array. We haven't talked about concepts of arrays like multi-dimensional arrays, or finding the boundaries of an array, or jagged arrays, and the different types of arrays that can be created. But this should get you pretty far, at least for starters, and you'll need to research and learn more about arrays on your own. Let's move on now to iteration statements. Like I said earlier, an iteration statement allows you to loop through or navigate through each item in an array one at a time. Other iteration statements will allow you to loop through until a certain condition is met. And so we're going to look at variations on iteration statements. And I'm just going to show you a couple right now, but there are probably dozens of permutations of iteration statements. And just like the array that I mentioned a moment ago, how we've only kind of simplified it down to 2 or 3 different variations on it, there are actually many other variations, and I encourage you to learn more about iteration statements on your own. But let's start by pasting some code in here. Notice in the first line of code, I've created an initialized array, just like I did in the previous example, where I've set and initialized my array to Bob, Beth, Conrad, and Grant. So there are 4 elements, and what I've used first of all is a for each statement. Now in that line of code, the for each, notice that I have defined in parentheses a temporary variable called person, string person. So for each person that you can find in my array, would be an English way of saying this, then execute the code block that's directly underneath the for each statement. So in this case, we're just going to show the name of that person in a message box. Okay, so what would you expect to happen if we executed this line of code? Well, we would start with Bob. It's the first person, I guess you'd say, in my array, the first string in my array. And we'd show that in a message box. And then the for each statement would move on to the next value in my array, assign that temporarily to the person value, to the person variable, and then display whatever's inside the person variable this time, which would be Beth. And it repeats those steps over and over until we have 4 message boxes, Bob, Beth, Conrad, Grant. Okay, let's run the application real quick just to see if it does this. Notice Bob, Beth, Conrad, and Grant. Great. So a for each statement is a very easy way to iterate through all the items within an array by pulling out each element of the array and putting it into a temporary variable that we define within the for each statement. And then we can do whatever we want to. In this case, we just simply painted it to a message box, but we could make a more complex example, but we'll hold off on that for now. Let's move on. Okay, this time I'm going to paste in another example. This time we're going to have a look at the for iteration statement, and it looks dramatically different from the for each statement that we just reviewed a moment ago. Notice first of all that we're not going to deal with arrays this time. Now we could modify this example to loop through each element of my array, but I've chosen not to do that just so you can see that you don't have to use iteration statements always in conjunction with arrays. In this case, let's take a look at the for statement and what's in between the open and closed parentheses on that first line. Int I equals 0. Okay, notice that there's first of all 3 sections within this for statement. There is the int I equals 0 separated from the next piece using an end of line character, our semicolon. The next part is I less than 5. separated with a semicolon from the last part, which is I++. Okay, the first part's defining a temporary variable, I, and we're initializing I to the value of 0. The next section is a condition. So while I is less than 5, we'll continue to iterate through the code block that's directly underneath the for statement. So everything between the curly braces, which in this case is just one line of code. Messagebox.show I.toString. We'll talk about that in a moment. The final part is that every time after we execute our code block and we return to our for statement, we want to increment the value of I by 1. So that's the little nomenclature of the plus plus after the value of I. So how does this work? Let's set a breakpoint and let's run our application. Click our button and let's move this up so we can see it a little bit better. Okay, first of all, we're defining I is equal to 0. As I hover my mouse button over it, you can see the value of I is currently 0. Let's click our Step Into button. We're going to consider whether or not 0, which is the value of I, is less than 5. That's true. So notice that now we're moving down to our code block, and in this line of code, we're going to show the value of I. Now, since it's an integer, and we talked about converting values explicitly through the use of the toString method of an integer in about a video or two ago, that we're going to now convert 0 to a string and then show it in a message box. And that's what we have here. So now notice the next thing that happens is that I will be incremented. So I was 0, and now I equals 1 is going to be evaluated again. I is 1, is that less than 5? Yes. So continue to run the code block. Here we go again. This time showing the value of 1. Let's run it again. I is currently 1, but after we execute this line of code, I is going to be equal to 2. 2 is less than 5, so we're going to execute this again. And I think you get the idea at this point. Let's just go ahead and step through this. This time we get 4. Now what will happen this time? I is currently 4. After we execute that section of code, I is now going to be equal to 5. Is 5 less than 5? No. 5 is equal to 5. So at this point, we kick out of our for statement and continue on with any extra code that comes after the for statement, in which case there is none, so we're going to exit this method and continue on with our application. Okay. So hopefully this will make a little bit more sense after we've stepped through it and to track the progress of our for statement. Let's comment out this line of code and look at another example of an iteration statement. This time we're going to look at a while statement. Now the practical difference between example 8, the for statement, and example 9, the while statement, is that we've defined the value that will keep track of our iterations outside of the scope of the while statement. So this becomes important whenever we want to perform some work within our while statement, but not lose the value after we exit our while statement. So in this case, once we have finished iterating through according to the commands that we've given within the while statement, the value of I is still accessible to us, and we can display that to the end user. Now for this example, I forgot I need to add a text box. So let's go ahead and plop one of those, and we'll just leave the default name, textbox1. Save that. So we're going to allow the user to type in the value of textbox. So this is the other part that's a little bit different from the examples before. Up to this point, we have hard-coded all the values, but this time we're going to let the end user determine how many times we're going to iterate through our iteration statement. Okay, so we're going to type in a number to the text box, and then while our iterator value is less than the value that the user typed in the text box, we're going to just increment the value by 1. So we're just going to continue to test the value of I And once we finish, then we'll display what the final value of the while statement is. This is a little nonsensical example. Probably all the examples were up to this point. But let's set a breakpoint and watch the execution of this, just like we did in the previous example. So here, just for brevity's sake, let's use a low number like the number 2. And I'm going to click the button. Now notice that I is equal to 0, textbox.1.text equals 2. So while I is less than 2, we're going to execute the code block underneath our while statement. Let's step in to the line of code. I was 0, but after executing this line of code, I will equal 1. So notice that the increment of the while statement is not handled within the while, unlike what we saw in the for statement. It's handled by us within the body of the code block. So that's another little nuance of the difference between the while and the for. And here we're going to continue to execute this because 1 is less than the value 2 that we typed in. We're going to increment I one more time, putting our value 2 equal to the value 2, which should kick us out of our while statement. Now we move on to our last statement. Do we still have access to the value of I? Yes, we do. So we're going to, because it was not defined within the context of our while statement, it was defined outside of it. So we still have access to it. We're going to display the final value was 2. After we did all of our looping, we were able to determine what I was and continue to use that throughout the context of our method. Let's just continue on with this. Okay, let's comment this out. So once again, 3 different iteration statements that are essentially doing the same thing, iterating through, executing a block of code through each iteration, but are a little bit different depending on the scenario that we're facing within our code. In some cases, the for each is going to be more elegant than the for in the while statements. And in other cases, the for, the while might be more elegant. It just depends on what we're trying to accomplish within our code, but we have several different tools that allow us to do that. Again, there are more permutations, but we're not going to take the time right now to go through all those. These will get you pretty far throughout the rest of the examples that we're going to demonstrate within this series of lessons. Okay, so next what I want to do is combine some of these thoughts together into one example. You'll see here that we have arrays, iteration statements, and selection statements all defined together in the exact same example. The first line of code, string myArray, we're defining an array and initializing its values. So there are 4 elements, Bob, Beth, Connor, and Grant. The next line of code is our for statement. We're defining, first of all, within our for statement, an iterator, and we're initializing its value to 0. The next chunk of code within the for statement, we're going to evaluate the current value of I and make sure that it's less than myArray.length. Now, what is this myArray.length? Well, you should recognize myArray. And the dot length is a property of an array which tells me how many elements are currently in the array. What do you think the value of length will be? If you guess 4, you're correct. Bob, Beth, Conrad, Grant, the number of elements within the array. So this simply tells me how many items. So as long as I is less than 4, then we're going to add 1 to our I value and iterate through the code block beneath the for statement another time. Now within that code block, you'll see that we have an if statement. If myArray element of I equals to Conrad, then execute the block of code underneath the if statement, which is simply a message box to show that we have found the element of the array that contains the value Conrad. Okay, so what about this if statement? Notice that instead of hard coding the value, the index for my array, I've instead used a dynamic value, the value of I, our iterator. So this is a method for me to, on each iteration, check the value that is stored within that particular value of I. So when my array with an index of 0 is an index of 0, we'll check it and to see if it's equal to Conrad. The next time through, it will check my array sub 1 or an index of 1 if that's equal to Conrad, and so on until we find Conrad, in which case then we will execute the message box. So let's put a line break here and then run our application. Click our button and we'll start stepping through. Here, let's move this up where we can see it a little bit better. Great. Okay, so I should equal to 0, and is I less than my array? Notice that the length is equal to 4 as I hover my mouse cursor over that property. And so now we're going to start executing my array sub 0. Is that equal to Conrad? No. So now we're going to iterate increase 0 to 1 and check this again. Is 1 less than 4? Yes, it is. So let's check this again. What about my array with an index of 1? Is that equal to Conrad? No. Let's increment it, evaluate it, and check it again. My array with an index of 2. Is that equal to Conrad? This time we have found Conrad, so we're going to display the message box, found Conrad. Now what do you suppose will happen? Do you think we'll just exit out of this for loop and continue on and complete our method? Let's execute the next line of code. Notice that we didn't break out of our loop here, and we're going to evaluate the next value. So if we wanted to stop right here and not execute any more lines of code, we would need to include a break statement after our message box.show, so on that very next line, because we would want to stop the execution. So the break statement that we learned about earlier when we were looking at switches applies to if statements and for statements as well. So let's continue evaluating, and we know the answer to this question. And now I should equal 4. Is that less than 4? No, it's equal to 4. So we'll kick out and end the execution of our method. Great. Okay, so I've taken the liberty of commenting out example 10, which we just looked at, and let's move on to the next example. And this time I've pasted in a pretty lengthy example that is going to feature the list box. Now, one thing I want to do to the list box is change one of its properties. So I'm going to drag this over. And this time I want to allow a multi-selection. So let me see if I can find that property here. Selection mode is currently set to 1, but I'm going to select multi-simple. This should allow us to select multiple items in the list box, or the user to, by holding down either the shift or the control button on the keyboard to get different results. Okay. So once I made that little change, I'm going to go back to my code example, and we're going to take a look at what this example will actually do. First of all, we start out with a for statement this time, and we are creating our iterator that I've called I. Now, why do I call it I? That's just what I personally do. I've seen people call it counter or iterator or use various other letters of the alphabet. It's just a force of habit that I learned whenever I was first programming in another programming language, and I brought it over to C# as a convention that you'll see many authors and people who write articles use for iterators. But you can call it anything you want to call it. Just you should call it something that makes sense, like a counter or like iterator or something along those lines. Okay, so int I equals 0. Now what I want to do is evaluate I against how many items were actually selected. So this time I use listbox1.count .selectedItems.count. I want to find out how many items were selected by the end user. 1 item, 2 items, 3 items, whatever the case might be. That's the number of times that we want to loop through our code block underneath the for statement. And then we want to increase the incrementer by 1, the iterator by 1. Okay. Now the next line of code, the switch statement, we're going to find the current value for the, starting with 0, the first selected item. Then we're going to move on to the second selected item and so on, depending on how many items were actually selected by the end user. So what the selected items will do is return one item and allow us to evaluate it within the context of a switch statement. So we're going to see, was the first selected item the foobar, BASQuark, widgets, or gadgets? What is it? And then we're going to show that value in a message box. Okay, so this is a method that we're going to find ourselves using time in and time out whenever we're working with Windows or web forms in order to determine what item was selected by the end user and then act upon that. Okay, so what I'll do is set a breakpoint here, and then let's run our application. Now what I'm going to do is select BASQuark, and then I'm going to hold down the control button on my keyboard and select gadgets. So I have two items selected, and I'm going to click button 1. Okay, so here we're going to start stepping through. How many items were selected? 2 items were selected. Okay, great. So far so good. So let's look at the first item that was selected. Notice that immediately it jumps to the case of BASQuark. That is the first item that was selected, and it's going to now display a message box. Great. So we have finished the first iteration. We're going to increment I from 0 to 1 and make sure that 0 is less than the number of items that were selected. So 2 items were selected. We're going to look at the second item, which is 1, and evaluate that. And now notice that the second item was indeed gadget. So we're going to display that in a message box. And we found both items that were selected. Now we're going to continue to iterate through and evaluate, but this time 2 is equal to the count of 2, so this will, as we know, just finish out. And we've looked at this example. So that's a pretty useful chunk of code that you'll find yourself writing over and over again to evaluate what values were selected in some type of an input control, like a list box or a combo box that allows multiple selections, or radio buttons that are within a group, or whatever the case might be. Okay, so we've come to the end of this lesson. We've rapidly looked at selection statements, which allow us to branch based on certain conditions. We've looked at iteration statements, which allow us to loop through and execute code based on some criteria. We've also looked at arrays, which are groups of values that are somehow linked together into a single variable that we can process. And so these 3 programming constructs allow us to create very intelligent applications that can more effectively respond to our users and make decisions based on the input that the users supply. So at this point, we are able to create many applications and make them very effective and allow them to be rather rich. And so we're learning quite a bit, and we're only on lesson 5. But in the next lesson, we're going to even pick up the pace a little bit more. And we're going to talk about some advanced programming concepts called object-oriented programming, and it's a way of looking at or understanding programming. So I really encourage you to take a deep interest in the next lesson. But if you enjoyed this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one, aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic.net, ASP.net, and more. Thank you.